Let me start, okay? Can you hear me well? Right. I'm a psychologist, and this subject will fall under the broader topic of construction of the self, how we understand ourselves. And when I bumped into this question, and I decided to apply it to a very famous guy, who is Solomon Shereshevsky, and you probably read the book by Alexander Luria. So we are in the frame now, in the time frame of the 30s, 40s, and 20s of the last century. So you should understand it's not something about present. It's about far and far away past. And I talked to Mr. Saitovic and asked him this question when he read Lurias' book first. And it was, the answer was that he read it in the 70s. So we are in the frame of 70s to about 20s. Can I run my presentation? It's on the desk. I know it's a very banal thing to ask after all these talks and events on synesthesia, what it is like to be a synesthete. So let me rephrase it a bit. What is it like to be a synesthete under Stalin's regime? And the question is not how it is like to be different, but do I know about myself at all? And what do I know? Shereshevsky paradoxically came to fame first through American press. In 1947, on July the 12th, New York Times ran an article on Shereshevsky. And it was a reprint as published by TASS. This is a Soviet agency of news spread. And other papers followed. So this is a Lewiston Evening that followed and printed the same article almost word for word about Shereshevsky. So mine, this is 1947. There is another link to America, who is Shereshevsky's nephew. He's now 92, and he lives in New York, still alive, and he remembers much about Shereshevsky alive. And we conversed with him quite much, and he told me that his stories about Shereshevsky, what the person he was, etc. But that's not the only source that I've discovered besides Luria's book. Eisenstein's diary and Eisenstein's book. Sergei Eisenstein was a Russian director, a movie maker. Then came lots of other scientists, psychologists who did study Shereshevsky. Let me briefly just make this historical excursion to Shereshevsky's life. He was born in Tarzhok. This is Tver Governorate, or Tverskaya Oblast in Russia. This is 200 kilometers from Moscow. And actually, he was of Jewish descent, and the Jewish couldn't come close to big cities because of the limitation for the residents. And in Russia, it was called Pale of Settlement. Pale of Settlement is a ban for Jews to live next to big cities. So they should cluster to some местечкos, this is kind of special word for towns. So Shereshevsky lived in such a местечко, and then the family, the Shereshevskys, decided to move to a better developed place, which is Rezekne, which is in Belarusia. And Rezekne now is in Latvia, and this is where the story really starts, of real Shereshevsky, not how it was described in Luria's book. And really, Rezekne was occupied by Nazis And all Shereshevsky, according to my guess, actually were exterminated. And Shereshevsky himself is described by Luria as a lost guy, and Luria ascribes this to his synesthesia and to his unusual mind. But my idea is that you can be lost and feel lost if you know that all your family was exterminated and you can't even utter a word about it in Russia. So this is Moscow, and when the Pale of Settlement was abolished, Shereshevsky came with his wife to Moscow. And we definitely know that he lived there at least in 1923 when they had a kid. The very first publication that I could find in Russian press was Lurias' article about Shereshevsky, and it dates back to 1967. Actually, 1967 is too late because there is a gap of 20 years between the English press, the article in the in the American press, and the Russian press. It's a certain type of preview of Lurias' book, which is called The Mind of a Mnemonist, or a little book about a vast memory. But Luria concentrates on his synesthesia more in this article. And if you remember, who read the book, in the book he was called S, or just this anonymous acronym, anonymous initial. And Luria didn't give away who he was because he didn't just mention him to the full, so it was part anonymous. In this article, which is just was published a year before the book, Shereshevsky is mentioned by his full name. Luria's book is important as well, though nothing deeply personal is mentioned about Shereshevsky. So why? Because Luria's book really heralded lots of contemporary research topics. First, he gave this account of a complete personality, attentional characteristics, will, personality, memory, etc. It was all described as a profile. Next, Luria, though it sounds a bit patronizing towards Shereshevsky, but Luria gives this kind of empathy with his subject, and this is heralds in a way the neurodiversity movement that we all have now. And the book was really inspiring. It inspired a whole generation of neuroscientists and psychologists, including Richard and Larry Marks and me, myself, and Dr. Sachs, and they abundantly quoted Luria in their first publications. But Luria was not alone to study Shereshevsky, whose life changed dramatically after Luria and he met. And this is a surprising fact, but immediately in the 50s, when in 1929, Shereshevsky started touring Russia, and he visited several small towns and big towns and universities with his performances as a mnemonist. But nothing was too much about synesthesia. And for me, it's a lingering question, why? Because first of all, he was a synesthete and then a mnemonist. And this is a poster of his performance because he's got the same text, and they reprinted it in all towns that he came to and gave performances. It runs as that a master of memory, and he memorizes a selection of words and phrases in all languages by the audience's request. There was another guy, there was another scientist who studied him, and this is Alexei Leontiev. And actually, Leontiev studied him first before Luria. And he published a chapter in a book about Luria. And the interesting thing that Leontiev was tough to Shereshevsky. His approach was different from Luria's. In what way? Leontiev wanted to make Shereshevsky make mistakes. He always pushed his mind and memory to the limit just to understand how his mind works. And when he caught him making mistakes, he tried to decipher the mechanics of Shereshevsky's mind. For instance, one example of this interesting series of experiments. This was called associative memorization. Shereshevsky got a selection of cards, and each card should not be memorized, but it should be followed by a stimulus. For instance, I gave you a card of a butterfly, and I gave you the word flight. And then I gave you a card with an image of bread, and I give you like dinner. And Shereshevsky had a very hard time memorizing other people's associations, because his synesthesia was prompting him in its own way. And when he saw a butterfly, he started like looking at the butterfly and thinking about butterfly, and forgot everything about flight, etc. Well, and Shereshevsky wrote about this in his diary, and he said, I just didn't understand what the task was. So I memorized them all, both the associations and the explanations and the stimulus, and it was like he memorized it without any connections. Another scientist was Vygotsky. Vygotsky is exceptionally famous for his developmental theory, which was about social influences on other people's minds. And they worked quite a bit for a year or two, according to Shereshevsky's diary. And Vygotsky's idea was that Shereshevsky's mind is a kind of raw material for further development, or primordial form of consciousness that is not exposed or hasn't been exposed to culture and hasn't changed. Shereshevsky in his diary also gives reasons against this, because Shereshevsky did have mechanisms that mediated his synesthesia and his mind, but in a very special way. So culture did influence him, and he wasn't like having a primordial or unnaturalized consciousness. And Vygotsky gave Shereshevsky these stimuluses. And how do you think they are connected? Why do you think a scientist might give all this stimulus to a subject? Any guess? Yes, all right. They are related because these are synonyms. And Vygotsky thought if you have some mechanism to memorize something, you can't memorize synonyms because it's confusing. And Shereshevsky did successfully memorize all of them because he didn't use any mechanism except for his synesthesia. So we've got a whole array of scientists besides Luria studying Shereshevsky. But that's not all. Sergei Eisenstein was actually a friend of Shereshevsky. And both Eisenstein and Shereshevsky really explicitly state this. So it's not a hypothesis. They actually met and conversed. Eisenstein belonged to the Vygotsky circle. And actually, he visited the experiments and had really many talks with Shereshevsky. I worked with Eisenstein Archive, and there is a whole bunch of notes about Shereshevsky and how to work in the same way as a synesthete mind works. And here is what we've got. It's a kind of a table of Eisenstein's means to influence the viewer. In one of his notes, actually it was published in the book, Eisenstein says that Shereshevsky taught him about color symbolism. So when, for instance, white means happiness, etc. And here, this is the first color film in the Soviet Union, and it was much influenced by Shereshevsky. I will show you an episode before I will say anything about that. In this case, Eisenstein decided to use two colors. This a palette of swirling reds and deafening, engulfing black. And it was after a talk with Shereshevsky. And mind, this is Fortius. Why? Because the red and the black should represent Oprichniki's feet. Oprichniki were Ivan the Terrible's secret police. And they are famous for their bloody rampages. And so this engulfing red represents blood. But in the next phase, and it was in the next another film of Eisenstein, Alexander Nevsky, and Alexander Nevsky is also influenced by Shereshevsky's idea about color. But in this case, this is a dialogue between Shereshevsky and Eisenstein. Why? If you take a closer look, there is a kind of a paradox. Because usually when we mean something bad, an enemy, you use which color you think? Black or white? Black. In this case, this is reversed. So white represents enemy, and black represents victorious might of your own defenders, of your own military forces. For me, the most interesting episode is this. If you think of culture, Disney with his, no, we are in Hollywood, right? Disney was influenced by Oskar Fischinger much. All those kind of visual effects. And my claim is, and this is obvious in this episode, that Disney took much from Oskar the same way as Eisenstein took from Shereshevsky. And this is an experimental film, not very much known by Eisenstein. Can we have the sound, please? Mark, can we have the sound up, please? you think of sound effects, you usually think of Marcel Duchamp and French avant-garde. But this is a Soviet film, strongly influenced by a naturally born synesthete. And this was really surprising to me, how much and how far in the past it happened. In the first shot, I don't think it was clear, but it was an effect of the so-called drone sound. Drone sound is when you write directly into the soundtrack of the film with a kind of scratching or inscribing physically. And this was done again in a conversation